I'm here with Dr. Tim Gabbett. Tim, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to kind of jump on here. I know you've been on a lot of podcasts, you've done a lot of research and load management and a lot of consulting work. But for the listeners at home who may not have heard of you, will you tell us a little bit about your background, kind of your motivation and where you are currently?
Yeah, okay. Firstly, thanks for inviting me on. Most of my work for the last 25 years has been in sport, day in, day out, working with athletes, working with coaches. So that's where I feel most comfortable. I do, as you say, I have done some research in different areas, and that's probably made more of a hobby for me than anything else. It's for a lot of time, I guess the best way to describe it, some people go fishing, some people play golf, and I just wrote.
Yeah.
So I found that kind of a little bit cathartic.
Okay.
And now I still do both of those things. But I feel like my main goal at the moment is to try and help people understand scientific language.
Yeah.
Because I think there's a real gap, and the gap's probably growing larger and larger between what's happening in scientific journals and the writing that's in scientific journals, and what practitioners, what coaches want to know. And I feel like part of what I'm doing at the moment is trying to bridge that gap between the science and the reality of the real world.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Okay, and then you talked a little bit about your coaching background and being around sport, right? So how have some of your past positions kind of set you up for success now and what you do now?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's an assumption there that I've got success at the moment, but I think everything we do sets us up to where we are right now. So all of those struggles, all of the things where you get knocked down along the way and you have to pick yourself up and dust yourself off and decide what you're going to do as a result of that. That determines where you are right at this moment. And the way I really think the way you respond to those moments are really what defines you down the track. And you don't know it. You can look back at those moments and you go, "Oh, that was a terrible time," or I'm so glad I hope I never have to go through that again. Or you can just almost embrace it for what it is. That without those moments, you may not be in the position that you're in right now. And those moments, I feel, actually, I don't know if they define you, but they really shape the kind of person you are down the track. So I look at the little challenges along the way, and there's lots of challenges, and I really feel for people who are starting out in their career, and they go through similar challenges. But the best advice I can give them is just accept the little moment for what it is, because you won't value that moment until somewhere down the track it becomes a memory, and you look back on it and you go, that moment was really important for me.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, that's big. And so, I mean, on that same token, right, what are some recommendations that you have to young coaches or coaches in general who are trying to do something similar as you?
Well, it's a slightly different world from when I first started, because sports science in professional teams didn't really exist. There was sports scientists working in the Australian Institute of Sport and the academy system.
Okay.
And there were there were science trained academics in universities, but they didn't necessarily work in sport. we had to kind of create our own roles a little bit in the teams that we worked with, and we had to do a pretty long apprenticeship. So you would spend time with a lower level team. You probably wouldn't get paid for it. You'd make a lot of mistakes along the way, and then eventually you'd work your way up to a higher level team, or eventually a position might open up once that sport caught on to the fact that sports scientists can offer something to your team. Whereas now it's a little bit different. You can complete a degree and you can walk into a high level job. Now that is, that's obviously great for the profession, because it it shows that the profession is growing. But I also feel like people who haven't had the opportunity to go through an apprenticeship are missing a valuable part of the learning phase. So that, if I had some advice, I would say do your apprenticeship, spend some time at a lower level team, even if it means as you're doing your degree, do an internship or just volunteer with the team where you're doing some coaching, or you're just getting your hands dirty and you're making some mistakes, because those mistakes in general, they won't be, the consequences won't be as large than if you make those same mistakes at a higher level. So get it out of your system early, and learn from those mistakes, and you'll have a lot more to offer when you actually do get to that high performance level.
That's great advice, and I feel like a lot of people don't think like that, right? They try to go for that big top spot as soon as possible, and then, like you said, they kind of falter because they haven't been able to refine their process or anything like that. So I think that's huge.
Yeah, well, I think it's just human nature, really. Like if you're presented with an opportunity, you don't stare a gift horse in the mouth. Most people will take that opportunity. But you've also got to accept the fact that, well, if you take this opportunity, potentially there could be consequences of that. So like anyone, if it's offered to you, you're probably going to take the chance, because the chance might not come round again. And that's kind of the nature of our profession as well. There's a lot of graduates coming out, and there's only so many jobs. So if you get the opportunity, you kind of take it. But I really think there's it's a valuable foundation. It's just this massive brick that you can put in your house really early in place. And it gives you a shot at becoming successful down the track. Really sustained success, rather than I'm here now, so I've made it. It gives you a chance at sustained success.
I like that. Okay. And so moving forward a little bit, right? So obviously you've done a lot of work in the field with some performance and research articles, right? And so on some of these publications, instead of kind of diving into the specific content matter, which we can touch on some of that later, but what I find really interesting is, kind of the process, and a lot of people don't know how much work goes into creating some of these publications or these resources that you've put out and made so easy to use for coaches, right? And so one of my questions is, what is the first thing to know when even considering contributing or writing a publication?
Probably the first thing that comes to mind when you ask that is, people often contact me and say, I've got all this data. I just need help analysing it. And I'll say, well, what's your question? And they'll say, well, I've got all this data and I just need help analysing. Okay, well, I understand that's one part of your question, but the real question is, what is your research question? What do you want to know? And that's where I think some people get it wrong, is they think writing a paper or for publication is about just collecting some numbers and then we'll write it up later. The first thing you have to have is a question. So you start with the end point in mind, but you've got to have a question. And I really think if you're you can develop your questions from reading the literature. You can do that, but I really think the best questions that I have had come up with just hanging out with coaches and hanging out with support staff, and having those conversations, and that drives your questions. And then if there's no research to answer that question, or it's a little bit to the left of what you really want to answer, then you've got a little gap there in the knowledge where you can go about answering that question. But you've got to have the question first, and the question comes from being involved in the sport. So if you look at some researchers, and I've seen some studies that things like they've looked at what's the difference between winning and losing teams, and then they'll highlight this one thing. See, the winners do more of these things, and I go, well, what does PS stand for? And they'll say, yeah, that's points scored. Points scored. The winners will score more points than the losing teams. Yeah. I'm going, okay, well, that's common sense, isn't it? Like, do we really need to do the study? Yeah. To answer that? So like, that's why you hang out with some coaches and you get the actual questions that they really want to know. They don't want to know about stuff that's obvious. They want to know about stuff that's actually going to help them from day to day. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. There's a lot of redundancy and people just want to put their name on something. So, that comes about. That's funny. Yeah. So, that's probably the starting point for me is start with the question. So have a good question to start with, and then from there you can that informs how you design your project, how you want to go about designing it, and then how you're going to collect your data, what variables you can reasonably collect. You also have to be mindful of for some particular studies, don't collect too many variables, because if you don't have enough a great enough sample size, then that's going to impact the actual analysis you can do, statistical analysis. So there's a whole heap of after that original question of this is the question I want to answer. Yeah. Then there's a whole heap of design type questions or problems that you have to solve as well. Okay. And so with that, do you think that within sport, right, there's a lot of things that we don't know, and there's a lot of things that people have done research on, and it seems like a lot of the things that people have done research on, it's not necessarily conclusive, right? It's just it's one study. How do you go about, say, maybe doing a similar study without completely just recycling someone else's, work, or basically doing the same exact thing that someone's already done, right? How do you kind of make it different and, I guess, verify? Yeah, I guess that's there's always going to be a slight variation that you can put on that project. Okay. And I can give you an example of when I first did my PhD. The work that I did it on is completely different than what I'm working in now. But there was a lot of research evidence at that time that was very equivocal on this particular area. You'd have one group that would say this is the exact thing that happens. There was one group that would say no, this is the exact opposite thing, and then there was another group that would say no, when you use this intervention, nothing happens. So there was kind of like three different schools of thought on it. Yeah. And my supervisor at the time said, well, would you like to do something like this? And I looked at the research and I said, well, geez, there's so much that's being done on it. But the slant that we took was, well, we took a different population, and they were all athletes that the work had been done on. So we took an older population, and this particular intervention was that they were saying at the time endurance training. That endurance training decreased your blood pressure control system, or decrease the effectiveness of your blood pressure control system. So it made you less effective to postural changes. So when you stood up quickly, you were more likely to faint. Now that's a problem for athletes, but then that problem's exacerbated if you add in an older person who already has a down-regulated blood pressure system, or down-regulated control of their blood pressure system. So not only do they stand up and they black out once they get fitter, but they also, maybe they break a hip, and if you break a hip, the chances are you're going to die within a year. So on the one hand, we're giving them physical training to get them fitter and improve their functional capacity. On the other hand, there's a chance by doing that we're actually making them less likely to live. So that became kind of the way we sold that argument. We went for a different population, and in the end we went, potentially this has far greater consequences for the elderly than it does for an athlete population. Just to complete the circle, we answered the question and we got them fitter, and nothing else changed at all. So it was a good result in here. We could train them, we could get them fitter, so we can improve their functional capacity, and we don't have to be concerned about their blood pressure control system. It functions just as well as it used to. So. So we answered a question as well. It would have been nice to get a positive or a negative result either way, but a result is a result. And the result was that you can train and not be so worried about the negative consequences of that.
Okay. So going on with this process, right? So we're figuring out a question, or we have a question. And so how do we move forward with that? Thinking about, say we haven't necessarily got the results yet, but once we get the results, how do we answer it more in sport language versus in physiological language, right? Because you talked about it earlier, right? There's a lot of a big gap between like the results and the scientific language versus what the sport coaches want to know, right?
Yeah, look, our mantra, if you like, is always been make a difference to the sport.
Okay.
And that's our focus. So I don't go into a coaching meeting and thrill them with big words or thrill them with brilliant language. All we do is we sit down and we talk about the results in what it means for the coach. We want to make a difference to the sport. That's our number one priority. If a paper comes on the back of that, then that's an added bonus. But we don't go into this is the philosophy that I have with my team is that we don't have to go into a sport looking to do research looking for a publication output. If it happens to get a publication at the end of it, then okay, that's a bonus. And we obviously the language we use around coaches is going to be different from the language that we use in a scientific paper. But our first goal is make a difference to the sport.
Okay, I like that. And so once you got that right, you figured out your why, you figured out your question. How do you mitigate for some of these confounding variables that might be kind of creeping in, or that you might not have even considered?
Well, I mean, the first thing you do in your design phase is you try and think about all of those confounding variables. So you road test your design against, say, another researcher. You talk about some of these potential confounders with the coaches as well, because coaches that'll be the first thing they'll say is when you come back with the results, well, what about this? Or what about that? And so you have to be prepared that there are potential confounding variables that you can't control for, and that unless you have a very controlled environment, you can't remove those. So you just have to accept that they're a limitation of your study. And that's part and parcel of applied sports science research. That if you want to do some in-game analysis, or if you want to, injuries is a classic example. For example, a lot of our work has been to look at load and injuries. What's the relationship between load and injuries? Now we know now that there is a relationship between load and injuries, both a positive and a negative relationship there. That it can increase risk or it can decrease risk. But we also know that there's other factors at play, that biomechanical factors or psychosocial factors or weather conditions or ground conditions can all play a role. But we also know that if it rains for 7 days straight in Portland and the grounds are a little bit slippery and muddy, we can't control that. The players are still going to go out and train on that. Now, we can make a note of it, and maybe we can build it into the analysis. But then the next part is that the more variables that you build into your analysis, the more injuries that you need. And generally, it's a 1-to-10 ratio, 1 to 15 ratio. So for every variable, you need 10 injuries. So you either need to increase your sample size by getting more teams, which is a problem in itself because a lot of other teams aren't going to collaborate with you because it's their magical data that they don't want you to see. Or you just accept that it's a limitation and you reduce the number of variables. And that's, at no point just because we find a relationship between load and injuries that we say we've found the holy grail, and that load is the only thing that's related to injuries. We just accept that there are other variables that could contribute to this injury problem. And it's just a limitation of that comes about as a result of the sample size. We can't build more variables in because our sample size isn't big enough to allow us to do that.
Okay. And so with some of that variable manipulation, right, is there a upper limit of variables that you specifically like to look at, or a lower limit, or like what's that number kind of look like in terms of parsing out meaningful variables?
Well, if we're talking about it depends on the sport, and it depends on the question, of course. I guess we want to try and collect as many variables as we can for it to be useful, but we want to collect as few variables as possible in order for us to do our job. So I guess my thinking has changed a little bit over time, where if you're doing a particular study, once the study starts, you can't go back and start again. So on the one hand, you go, well, let's look at as many different things as we can. What are all the possible options, and we'll tick them all off. Whereas my thinking's changed a little bit in recent times, where I go, well, what's the least amount of information I need in order to do my job? What's the least amount of information that I need to help make a decision for this coach? What's the least amount of information that's going to, or what's the information that I need that's going to pose the least stress on my athlete? Because the more variables we start to collect, the more they become like a lab rat and less like an athlete. They get more focused on the research, and they forget how to play football, or they forget how to play basketball. They forget why they're there. So if we're looking at an injury type study, predictors of injury, then you need, the ratio is kind of one variable for every 10 to 15 cases. So if you have 50 injuries, then the most you can take is 5 variables. So you really need to be quite careful about how you pick them. Now there's different statistical techniques that you can choose to pick those variables. So principal component analysis is one method that you can use. But I generally just go back to the researcher and say, if they're working the sport, trust your eyes.
Yeah.
So if you're looking at baseball and you want to know what's the most important variable for a baseball pitcher that might contribute to say throwing injuries,
mm-hmm.
and then you have a think about that and you go, well, is heart rate going to be the variable? Well, it might, but it probably wouldn't be the first one that come to mind for me.
Yeah.
The first one that would come to mind to me is, well, how many times is he throwing the ball?
Mm-hmm.
That'd be the first one. And you can obviously, there's different types of throws, but that to me is one of the big rocks that you would want to measure.
Okay.
So I encourage researchers to, and this comes back to learning the game.
Yeah.
Take the time to learn the sport, and once you learn the sport, trust your eyes, and if it looks like it's going to be important from a performance point of view, it probably is going to be important from an injury point of view as well.
Yeah. Funny how that works, huh?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So how do you manage things when they don't quite go as planned, right? So say you have your study design, everything seems pretty sound, right? But then, for example, maybe your population size starts to diminish due to, whatever circumstances.
Yeah, well, I mean, ideally, what you would do is you'd if it's one where you can control, you identify as the minimum sample size you need, and then you also account for potential dropouts along the way. So you just say you calculate that your minimum sample size is going to be 20. Then you might also say, well, we anticipate, based on previous research, that there's going to be a 20% dropout, so you build extra numbers into your sample size. So rather than go with 20, you maybe go with 24. So by the end of the study, you're still left with those 20 subjects. Now, in an applied setting where you're working with a team, let's say you have a basketball team and you've got 14, 15 players.
Yeah.
When you start, you have to think, well, do I have enough? Is my sample size big enough to answer the question that I want to answer? So if you want to look at some strong relationships between load and injury in a single basketball team, then the first thing that you'll need to go is, well, is 15 players going to be enough? And most people would say no. So then the way you get around that is, well, we're going to have to study either more teams.
Yeah.
We're going to have to get every team in the comp to be involved, so we can increase our power, our statistical power, or we're going to have to study this team over multiple years.
Okay.
But either way, you're confronted with a situation of a small sample size. So perhaps it may be that you go, well, look, it's a great question, but given the constraints we've got here, this is not a question that we can answer.
Yeah.
So you might have to think, well, what's the next question that you want answered? Because this one is a hard one to answer, given the resources we've got at our disposal.
Okay. And so with that, do you have any suggestions in terms of is it easier to do larger groups of studies, or is it easier to do similar groups over time?
Well, most of my work has been done on the same groups. So I've tend to work with smaller sample sizes, mainly because there was a relationship there with the team. So a lot of my work it comes from discussions with the coaches. The coach says, look, I'd really like to know something about this, but I know there's a lot of work on men, but we've got nothing on women. And we've got a female squad here. Can we do something here? Yeah. And that's where the question starts. So we sort of work around the team we've got. I try and put some projects in place where there's very little invasion, so that they're just doing what they would normally do, and I work around there. In terms of the really big studies, I'm really amazed and just really really pleased, but just amazed and impressed by what people like Martin Asker can do with his work in Sweden, and of course Roald Barr and his group in Norway. They do some very large studies. They're able to do randomized control trials, and I've never had a large enough group to work with, and to be honest with you, to do a study like that, I look at it and I go, it's very impressive. The way that they can coordinate it and the way that they can pull it all together. So they would be the better people to talk to about those larger studies and how they pull them off.
Yeah. Okay. And so say we have a question, right? We have a design and a structure of the study. Does there need to be a large amount of technology? Is that a huge limiting factor for, say, maybe some even some strength coaches or some researchers that want to participate in some of this research? Is that going to be a huge barrier to entry?
Well, it depends, I suppose, on your question.
Okay.
If you want to know whether power has changed as a result of your training, then you're going to need some technology to measure that. And to measure it in a sophisticated way, I guess you could easily do a counter movement jump with a Vertec, or with a bit of chalk on a wall, but that'll tell you whether jump height has changed. It won't necessarily tell you how they're achieving that jump. If you want to know if someone is running faster as a result of your intervention, then you can use a stopwatch. But then when you go to publish that, that probably won't pass the review test. So you're going to need some technology depending on what your research question is. Of course, there are other studies, for example, where researchers will use something like session RPE and wellbeing scales that can be done in its simplest form, could be done using pen and paper. And if they want to know the relationship between session RPE load and wellbeing and injury, then you can collect your injuries using pen and paper as well. So you apart from when you get to the data reduction stage and maybe putting it in Excel or you're putting it in a stats package to analyze it, for the most part you can get away with no resources. So there are, depending on your question, you don't need to have expensive resources all the time to answer good questions.
Okay. No, that's good to hear, because I know there's a lot of people out there with questions, right? But they always just think that they don't have the resources. But it sounds more like a lack of resourcefulness than versus a lack of resources in some cases.
But potentially, like I can remember really early on when and this goes back to the apprenticeship, I was working with a team that didn't have resources, that they didn't have a lot of. We had a lot of players, but we didn't have much else. And we also had coaches asking questions. What if we did this? What if we did that? So we did our best to answer those questions with very minimal resources. And some of those early studies I look back on, and they were a lot of fun trying to work out what was going on with that team, and but we had no resources to do it. So some of our early load measurements were before GPS. Wearable GPS had become publicly available. So all we had was session RPE.
Okay. Gotcha. Fair enough. And then will you take us through, so right, we got our question, we got our structure, we got our population, and then we figured out whether or not we need technology, right? So say we've conducted our study, we've done all that kind of stuff. What does that publication process even look like? Where do you go from there, right? So you have this data, you've parsed it out, and you've done some analyzing with it. Where do you go from there?
Well, I mean, let's say you've written a first draft of the paper, and you're thinking, all right, this is ready to go. This is ready to submit to the journal. Then you give it to someone else to read. So you either give it to one or all of the authors who are listed on the paper, or maybe you send it to someone external who isn't necessarily familiar with the topic, or they could be familiar with the topic, doesn't matter, to get some independent feedback on it.
Okay.
And then the amount of red ink that comes back on that paper, you go, oh, okay, maybe I jumped the gun a little bit here.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not quite ready.
Yeah.
So you go through a number of iterations with that paper. And sometimes it can be very, very few if you write really well. And if your writing needs work or it doesn't come naturally to you, then it might be a number of iterations. But generally, the first draft is not the one that gets submitted to the journal.
Yeah.
You're changing it all the time. You get to a point where everyone signs off and says, yep, we think it's ready to submit. You submit it to the journal. Now, in the old days, we used to put it in an envelope, and we had to send in 4 or 5 copies of that paper.
Yeah.
So that it could be, you would put it in an envelope, send it over to the States. It would take 2 weeks to get to the States. Then they would send it out to reviewers by mail.
Yeah.
And 12 weeks later, you'd get your reviewers' comments. In some cases, it's not much quicker these days. Although we do have the online versions to theoretically make it the online submission process to make it quicker.
Yeah.
In a lot of cases, it's not that quicker. But the same thing, you send it into the journal.
Yeah.
You say, this is a paper that I want to be considered for publication. It's original research. It's not going to be published anywhere else. Then you send it to the editor. The editor finds suitable reviewers. Sometimes they find suitable reviewers. Sometimes they don't. But they find reviewers that are theoretically experts in the field.
Okay.
And then they will come back and give you feedback on this paper. Now, different reviewers have different mindsets around the review process. Some reviewers have the mindset of finding ways to reject that paper. Other reviewers have the mindset of how can I help this paper get accepted. So you can see there's a slightly different approach there. Now, there's some papers that I've reviewed a lot of papers as well, and there's some papers that you look at and you go, look, there's just too many problems with this paper, or it's just not quite suitable for this journal, or whatever the reason. But what I try and do when I'm reviewing papers is to look at it and put myself in the author's position. If I was in this sport in these conditions, could I have theoretically done anything differently to make this a stronger design, a stronger study? And once you do that, you go, look, geez, there's some challenges with this environment that no one else can really understand until you're in that environment. Based on the challenges, I think that's the best design they could come up with. But at very least, they need to discuss those limitations. So you just sort of talk about, okay, you might recommend to them, look, I can see the challenges you had here. I can see that the question is good, and under the circumstances, I look at this as a potential limitation, but I can't see how I would have done it any differently. But I think you at least need to discuss that as a limitation. It comes back from the journal then. And sometimes it's rejected outright. Sometimes you get some positive reviews. Sometimes they're quite negative, but you get a chance to respond to those reviewers' comments. And then you respond. You change the paper as a result. You send it back. You might go through a number of back and forth iterations with that process until it's accepted. I think the longest one, or the most I had, was six back and forth one time with a journal. So
how long did that take, like in terms of chronological time?
Oh, look,
fair amount.
I would say maybe a year.
Okay.
But like, there's probably papers that I've had that have had fewer iterations back and forth with the journal that have taken much longer than that. Some journals take a lot longer. To review than others. So when you see a paper that comes out in 2010, the question might have been asked in 2006. The work might have been done in 2007 and 2008. 2009, you spent the first half of 2009 analysing and writing it, and then maybe it comes out 2010, 2011. So there's a fair bit of effort that goes in by the time you see the publication and the published paper.
Yeah.
It's almost like you've forgotten what you've done by the time it comes out.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Yeah, a lot of people don't think about that. I think most people don't think about that, right? You see a paper in 2010 and you're like, oh, this is recent, right? If it was 2010, obviously. But, looking...
Yeah.
That's crazy. But it makes sense,
textbooks,
right?
Textbooks are worse.
Yeah.
Textbooks take longer because they're drawing on the research that's already published, so they don't know what's...
Yeah.
It takes a little bit longer with textbooks for them to get published and whatever else. So there could be some new papers coming out by the time that textbook is published.
Yeah.
The most recent research cited in it is not that recent anymore.
Okay. Wow. It's a lot of stuff to consider.
Yeah.
So moving forward a little bit, right? And just a brief bit on training, right? So do you have any wisdom on like initial assessments or things that you like to use or see with specific populations?
Well, generally I start with the endpoint in mind. So I go, what does the sport look like? What are the demands of the sport?
Yeah.
What does this athlete need to do as part of his job? So I work my way back from that endpoint, and then I work out, well, what are the physical qualities that they need in order to do the job?
Yeah.
And that generally informs the assessments that I'll do. So I'll look at some sport-specific capacities.
Okay.
But I'll also, with the physios, I'll encourage them to do their own assessments, their own screening on local tissue capacity.
Okay.
And then once you do those tests, you can identify the factors that are potentially limiting a player's performance on an individual basis. So if you have someone who's really strong but not aerobically fit, then that informs the kind of work you should be doing with that player. And equally, if you have someone who's aerobically fit but can't has no speed, then that informs the kind of training that you do with that player. Yeah.
Okay. In terms of so we have some kind of internal, like external load type stuff. In terms of like within the weight room or anything like that, or specific injury metrics or protocols, do you have anything like that you like to look at?
In terms of internal and external load?
Or sorry, in terms of like protocols for specific injuries, right? So for example, say you have like a soccer population, right? And you're looking at, I know there's an article out there looking at like glute and hamstring capacity in terms of like a glute bridge. Anything like that, or?
I'll look at the specific tissue type, and then probably the first thing we will do is we will look to see what's out there in the area. So, for example, when we're working with our water polo players back home, a big part of water polo is throwing the ball. Now, it's not the only place where we get injuries, but we try and bulletproof our water polo shoulders, but there's not a specific water polo prehab program, if you like. So one of the ways that we dealt with that is we went straight to Martin Asker's work with handball and European handball, and we borrowed a lot of his European handball protocol and applied it to water polo. In AFL, the FIFA 11. With football, or in your world soccer, we would adapt that program and make it AFL specific. So we look at what's around there, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel for a lot of these things. So if you have a sport with groin injuries, then we look at what the Danes are doing with their adductor work. If we have some specific hamstring problems in our sport, then there's a whole heap of hamstring rehab and strengthening protocols that we can use. So we will use those. And again, though, we probably our first port of call is, well, what's the evidence around strengthening these areas, and we work on that first. We work on the evidence, and then we go, well, is there some other ways that we might be able to do that? And so, because there's a lot of different gurus out there with different ideas on things.
Yeah.
Typically, you'll find them on Twitter.
Yeah.
So, and last time I looked, Twitter wasn't a peer-reviewed publication. Yeah. So I go straight to the evidence first and evaluate that evidence, and then work my way down from there.
Okay. No, that's a great, kind of system that you have set up there. And then if we can go back a little bit, what was the specific resource that you had mentioned for groin injuries? The example?
There's the Copenhagen adductor protocol.
Okay.
So it's I'm just trying to think of I've got a feeling the name of the person who was heavily involved in that was Andreas Cerner.
Okay.
Although the Danes do some terrific work in that area, but they also do some terrific work in hamstring injuries as well. So in that part of the world, there's some really good work being done. Yeah. Plus, that as I mentioned before, the Scandinavians seem to do it better than anyone when it comes to randomized controlled trials. If you've got 700 athletes competing in a competition, they will get 98% of the teams involved. They will have 695 players involved in it. So it's really impressive how they're able to recruit as many and keep them involved in the study. It's they do a great job with that.
Okay. And then you had also mentioned, you said Martin, what was his last name?
Martin Asker. Asker. It's now Dr. Martin Asker. He just did his defense of his PhD over there in Stockholm.
Oh wow, okay.
And he's done a lot of work in European handball is his love, and he's done a lot of great work in that sport. Yeah. And he's also done some randomized controlled trials, which is a massive thing as part of a PhD. So if you want to get someone on your podcast, he's one person that I would highly recommend you talk to.
Fantastic. Okay, I might have to get your contact information from him or his contact information. That'd be fantastic. Sure. Okay, and then last kind of question on this kind of series, not necessarily training, but more related to like the field. There's a lot of kind of, let's say, positions that are kind of a hybrid of, say, sports science / fitness coach or strength and conditioning, depending on what world you're in, the title changes. But do you recommend getting a PhD for some of these hybrid positions? I know like sports science is more PhD related, but some of these more, let's say, practical based or, practice based positions, what would you recommend in terms of education there?
Look, not necessarily. I think you can be an effective strength and conditioning coach without a PhD, and equally, I think you can be an effective sports scientist without a PhD. I know some really good sports scientists who don't have a PhD. I think if the PhD, there's a few benefits of a PhD if you go through a good PhD system. One, it changes the way it's less about someone teaching you what to think and you start to learn how to think. Yeah. So that's in a good system. Now that's not always the case you can get a PhD sometimes and still not have that skill. Yeah. But that's one benefit. And again, you don't necessarily have to have a PhD to learn how to think. I think in a lot of cases, PhDs train people to work in universities. Okay, that's where you become a specialist in a university because you can't progress in a university system without one. Yeah. But more and more, what I'm seeing now in sport is that the good programs, the good teams are starting to think, okay, well, we know a certain amount now. This is what we know now. Yeah. But what's the game going to look like in 3 years' time? Or if we tried this, would this make us a better team? So what someone with some research skills can do is actually start putting some projects in place. Now, they could be behind the scenes. They could be without the players even knowing it.
Yeah.
They could be doing some work, finding out these answers to inform how that team operates down the track. So that you're trying to use best practice for the now, but you're also trying to be innovative in your thinking so that improves the best practice that you provide in 2 or 3 years' time, that you're constantly moving forward, you're constantly applying best practice, you're constantly being innovative.
Yeah.
So that's where someone with PhD type skills can add a little bit extra to the organisation, because they do have research training to put in some good projects in place to answer some applied questions that you have.
Okay. No, that's a good point, because a lot of people are, I think, lost on this one, and I feel like a lot of sport practitioners are starting to pursue PhDs just so they have some initials after their name, or before their name, if you will. But yeah, so I feel like a lot of people are, the reasoning is not necessarily there. It's just they're doing it just to do it. So that makes a lot of sense what you're saying.
Yeah, look, I don't think that's probably it's probably like doing a study because you think it'd be a good idea. And I think to do a PhD, a lot of people do a PhD because they don't have any options.
Yeah.
There's no job options, but they're smart enough to do one, so they stay in university a lot longer.
Yeah.
But if you've got a generally I think if you do a PhD because you're inquisitive, you're passionate about answering some questions, you want to learn some more about research, that's you want to add that string to your bow, then a PhD might be useful. But again, I don't think it's an absolute necessity that you have a PhD to be able to work in sport.
Okay, awesome. And then kind of the last question here. I know you're always working on something, so what are some current projects that you're currently working on, and how can people kind of reach out to you and follow your journey?
What am I working on at the moment? Look, there's always a new thing that stimulates me, and I think probably the one that has always been an interesting one for me is how the brain regulates exercise performance.
Okay.
And how the brain controls the sensation of pain, how the brain handles the sensation of fatigue. But tied in with this is a whole heap of beliefs from your athletes. What are their beliefs around pain? What are their beliefs around fatigue?
Yeah.
And unless I get to know what makes my athletes tick on an individual basis, then I can't write a program for them. I really can't. You can put some things down on paper and say do this, but you've got to take the time to actually find out their story and find out why they come to you in the first place. So I'm working really hard on this is more of a development thing for me, just working really hard on listening to their story, let them tell me what's important to them. And then that is so informative in the way I go about training them, and the kind of program that I put in place, some of the obstacles that are going to be that I need to be aware of, some of the barriers that are going to prevent them reaching their goals, and trying to move those barriers out of the road, or at least get them aware of those barriers. So it's that's a big thing that I'm working on at the moment.
Okay.
That's not necessarily a research project. That's as much about just working on some skills for myself, so that I can get more out of my athletes, so that I can help them achieve more.
Yeah.
And in terms of following me, look, we're on most social medias, but our all the stuff that we do, little courses, or if we're going to be in a certain place at a certain time, then our website's the best place to go. GabbettPerformance.com. We put little user-friendly blogs out there as well. So if you're not one for reading a lot of that sciencey language in journals, then we also do like a user-friendly blog to try and put it in a coach friendly language.
Okay. Awesome. Well then, Dr. Gabbett, thank you so much for your time. This has been fantastic. I think you've, you shed a lot of light on some things that I think people are thinking but aren't sure who to ask, So thank you so much for your time, and I really look forward to connecting with you soon again in the future.
It's my pleasure. But yeah, I appreciate you asking me to come on your show, and I really appreciate the effort that you went to in making this one a little different too. So you had to, made me think a little bit. So that's good. Thank you.